We'll begin. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Elaine. Elaine is the co-author of Wherever There's a Fight: How Runaway Slaves, Suffragists, Immigrants, Strikers, and Poets Shaped Civil Liberties in California, which was the recipient of a gold medal in the California Book Awards, and a starred review in Publishers Weekend. That's what I need, a
They
Publishers
do
Weekend.
take a lot, yeah.
um, Elaine was named San Francisco Library Laureate in 2010. She's a published book reviewer in many publications, and her she was a journalist in Southeast Asia. Her first book, Development Debacle: The World Bank in the Philippines, was banned by the Marcos regime. So this is that book that she's the only one in the room who has had a book banned, which puts her right at the front of the line for teaching something tonight. Um, and she's working currently on a book based on her discovery of her grandmother's diaries from 1905 to 1918, with entries from both from the old country, from a shtetl in Russia, and also from a tenement in Chicago. I know Elaine originally from the Mesa Refuge, where Elaine was the board chair. That's a writing retreat in Point Reyes Station that I was very fortunate to be gifted a week at. And Elaine is also a regular participant and leader of our Yiddish Tish that happens every month and will be happening this Wednesday. Elaine, it's delightful to see you as always, and so grateful to you for agreeing to lead us and teach us tonight.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank you and Barbara so much for inviting me to be part of this. I'm a newbie to the Shavuot teaching, and so I'm a first timer to this. As Erwin said, I learned about it through the Yiddish Tish, which I have learned so much, and I'm so grateful for that. So. Um, I think it's also really wonderful. I don't know how many of you were at Devorah's just last session, but it her talk about how women's voices have been suppressed all through history really actually is a good lead-in to this contemporary story. I also really want to thank Cindy Norwitz for her generous help and expertise. I couldn't have done this, PowerPoint and bibliography without her. And I will be mentioning a number of books and articles. Some I will be quoting from, and I've prepared a bibliography, and Cindy's going to put it at some point in the chat so that you can you can copy it and download it because I want you all to read Esther Kreitman's work. Um, I'm not an expert on Esther Kreitman or Yiddish women writers, although Erwin threatened to call me that. But I am fascinated by her, and she's one of my favorite writers. And I think her story and her family story still resonates strongly today. I'm also fascinated by the claim that she is the model for her younger brother, Isaac Bashevis Singer, story, the well-known story, Yentl, the yeshiva boy. And I will have, I think earlier today, this evening, we were promised learning some revelations. I have a revelation that I found in preparing for this evening about that. And of course, I'll give you a taste of her beautiful writing. Cindy, can we put up the first slide? Thank you. This is Esther Singer Kreitman as a young woman. I also wanted just to say that I hope those of you who know more about her brothers, Israel Joshua Singer and Isaac Bashevis Singer, will please join me in this conversation. I would love to know more about them and their complicated relationship to their sister. And I think we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so please chime in. Most of the work I'm going to quote from is fiction. So in terms of the actual reflection of her life, it must be taken with a grain of salt, but also many grains of truth. Both Isaac Bashevis Singer and Esther Singer Kreitman wrote from their own very intense experiences, what we might today called autofiction. The exception in the works I'm going to read from is the memoir of Maurice Carr, which is who is Kreitman's son, and he called it The Forgotten Singer, and it's based on many stories that his mother told him. But the contrast between their two versions, Bashevis and Esther's versions of their family life, could not be more stark. In his short story, Yentl the Yeshiva Boy, this is how Bashevis singer described his sister's relationship to their father. And this is a quote now um, from Yentl the Yeshiva Boy. And I think we can put up the slide of Yentl the Yeshiva Boy. It's just a page, the opening page of the book. Her father, Reb Todras, may he rest in peace, during many bedridden years, had studied Torah with his daughter as if she were a son. He told Yentl to lock the doors and drape the windows. Then together they pored over the Pentateuch, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the commentaries. She had proved so apt a pupil that her father used to say, Yentl, you have the soul of a man. So why was I born a woman? Even heaven makes mistakes. But this is how Esther Kreitman describes her relationship to her father in her autobiographical novel, Deborah. And the English translation of this novel is by her son, Maurice Carr. This is what she wrote. Michael was her younger brother who, in accordance with the centuries-old custom of Orthodox Jews, was being brought up to spend all the days of his life in the study of the Talmud. And father, what am I going to be one day? Deborah suddenly inquired, half in jest, half in earnest. For as long as she could remember, she'd never had a word of praise fall into her lot. Rev Avram Ber was taken aback. It was an accepted view among pious Jews that there was only one achievement in life a woman could hope for, the bringing of happiness in a home by ministering to her husband and bearing him children. Therefore, he did not even vouchsafe Deborah a reply. But when she pressed him, he answered simply, What are you going to be one day? Nothing, of course. The next slide, please. So this is a picture of the three singers that were the writers. Bashevis with the glasses on the left, Esther and Israel Joshua on the right. Renowned Yiddish scholar Anita Norwich notes that all the siblings wrote about the Warsaw of their childhood, but the brothers have much warmer memories. She wrote, quote, the gender differences are significant. While the brothers attempt to recreate the past, Kreitman seeks liberation from it. I'll just read that quote again. While the brothers attempt to recreate the past, Kreitman seeks liberation from it. Before I share a little more of Kreitman's writing with you, let me just put her life and writing in context. I want to ask, let's see if I can see you. How many of you have heard of her before? Could you raise your hand? Let's see if I can see you. Cindy, is there a way for me to see the people? No. Okay.
If you click on um, never mind.
Oh, it's okay. I just think about it. If any of you have ever heard of her, and have any of you ever read her work? No. Okay. How about Isaac Bashevis singer? Have you heard of him? Have you read his work? Okay. Quite a contrast. Hinda Esther Singer was born in 1891 in Bilgaraj, Poland. Her father, Pinchas Mendel Singer, was a rabbi, and her mother, Batsheva Zilberman Singer, was the educated daughter of the rabbi of Bilgaraj. Esther was the eldest of four siblings. Israel Joshua was born 2 years later, and Isaac Bashevis 13 years later. The youngest brother, Moshe, was born in 1906 and died during World War II. In their writings, the brothers often refer to her as Hindele. So if you come across in my father's court, the memoir from Bashevis, she'll be Hindela. Esther was very unhappy at home, where her desire to study and her attempts at writing were dismissed or scorned. And so she agreed to an arranged marriage to Avraham Kreitman, a diamond cutter in Antwerp. Her parents were happy because his family didn't demand a dowry. She got married in Berlin in 1912, and with the threat of World War I, the couple moved to London, where she lived for many years, and there she had a son. She also started writing again. She started with short stories, which she sent and published in several magazines. Can we have the next slide, please, of the cover of Deborah? Okay. Deborah was her first novel, and it was originally called, in Yiddish, it was called De Shadem Tanz. Erwin, correct me if I'm wrong. De Shadem Tanz. Okay. And it was written in 1936. That means the Devil's Dance. And it actually is taken from a scene at her wedding. It was published in English only 10 years later, where it was titled Deborah. Her second novel was Brilliantine Diamonds, because actually she knew a lot about the diamond trade because of her marrying into this diamond cutting family. And her next book, Blitz, and can we see the next slide, please, is a collection of short stories, which was actually published in Yiddish as Yichus Lineage in 1949, and in English as Blitz. In fact, it's really interesting because she wrote about both in the shtetl and then about her life in London. And it's called Blitz because of a lot of it takes place in London during World War II. And I'm going to read a little bit about from that in a minute. To earn money, she wrote for commercial publications and also translated two English classics into Yiddish. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So you wonder how many takers would there be for reading A Christmas Carol in Yiddish? And George Bernard Shaw's The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism. Ironically, her mother, who was highly educated, was no more supportive of her than her father. But Sheva, the mother, was the daughter of a rabbi, um, and her husband is depicted in the book Devorah as being very skeptical about the education of his wife. This is what Devorah says. I mean, Esther Kreitman says in Devorah, quote, "In his heart of hearts, Reb Avram Ver disapproved of his wife's erudition. He thought it wrong for a woman to know too much, and he was determined that this mistake should not be repeated in Devorah's case." Now, Bashevis admired his mother's intellect greatly, unlike the father, and even named himself after her. So when he and his older brother, Israel Joshua, started writing, they were both known as I Singer, and he wanted to distinguish himself. So he chose the name Bashevis as his middle name, and it was actually taken in honor of his mother, Batsheva. Now, Esther feels very differently. In Carr's memory, in Carr's memoir, her son's memoir, he shares this story. My mother wants a son, as she considers that the Almighty has made a great mistake in creating her female. It is unthinkable that he would not seek this opportunity to make amends. And when Hinda is born, she refuses to give the breast. They find a wet nurse who already has many children, and the wet nurse and her cobbler husband live in a one-room hovel. They put Esther under the table. But Sheva comes only once a week to look at and never to touch the child. At 3, she has been practically blinded by dust and cobwebs from the underside of the table. Now, Esther wrote about this experience in a story in Blitz called The New World. And this is an amazing experimental story for the time because it's written from the point of view of a fetus. in the first person. So it's the fetus inside the mother's womb and then being born and then having this experience of being sent to the wet nurse. And this story is called The New World, and it's in this collection, Blitz. So this is what she writes. My mother is weak and pale. She's unable to breastfeed me. Now they need a wet nurse. My grandmother says that she will not give me to a Gentile wet nurse if she can help it. But they find a Jewish wet nurse, and now I have the good fortune to be living with Razel. Not that she really needs anyone else around. They're living in a room the size of a large cupboard. When Razel brings me home, her husband comes to welcome me, carrying their smallest child in his arms, with the other 5 heirs swarming around him. He looks extremely pleased with my arrival. Now, what do you say to that, eh? Beams Razel. 10 zlotys a week. To cut a long story short, I was shoved under the table in my little cradle. My eyes wide open, I stare in amazement at the table's filthy underside, which is covered all over with spider webs. And I think with sadness, this is the new world I have tumbled into, and this is heaven. I weep bitter tears. And I just find it remarkable that this experimental form of writing in first person from a fetus's point of view, was something that she wrote in 1949. Quite amazing. As I mentioned, her mother, Batsheva, was very frustrated that she was much smarter than her husband and perhaps jealous of the daughter, and she didn't want her daughter to crave an intellectual life, so she didn't want to make the mistake of educating her. In fact, Israel Joshua Singer recalls in his memoir that when his sister asked the mother what she should be when she grew up, their mother answered her question with another, "What can a girl be?" She believed it was better to be content as a dairy cow than to be a lost spirit. She wants to study so badly. And she writes, Esther writes in Deborah about that. Now there was in the house a copy of Naominovitch's Russian grammar, which Deborah always studied in her spare moments. But whenever her father caught her at this mischief, he would hide the book away on top of the tiled stove out of her reach, and then she would have to risk her very life to recover it. She would move the table up against the stove, set a chair on the table, herself on the chair, and after all that trouble, clouds of dust and loose leaves from torn books, disused feather dusters, and God knows what else would come fluttering and tumbling down. Everything, in fact, except the Russian grammar. Nevertheless, during her 14 years of life, she had managed to learn all its contents by heart, and still she was dissatisfied. How tediously morning changed into afternoon and evening into night. How wearisome was her housework. And yet, beyond that, she was lacking something herself, hardly knowing what. She just wanted to study and read so badly. Now, throughout her life, she was subjected to various undiagnosed illnesses, both mental and physical. She had seizures, perhaps epilepsy, and dramatic mood swings, perhaps what we know today as bipolar condition. Her brother, Israel Joshua, called her a mad woman. And Bashevis, in the chapter My Sister, in his memoir, describes that as a child, quote, after weeping furiously, her spirit would suddenly soar and she would begin to dance, sometimes falling into a faint. He suggested maybe she was possessed by a dybbuk. So her mother was pleased about the arranged marriage because it was increasingly difficult to, quote, live with this erratic girl. Through a matchmaker, Esther is given a golden chain. Deborah is given a golden chain by the father of her intended and shivers, quote, at the touch of the cold metal and the thought that the most vicious of dogs might safely be tied up with a chain such as this. She and her mother take the train to Berlin to meet her betrothed, and on the way she shows her mother pages of stories in notebooks that she had written in secret. Her mother, who perhaps was worried that the Yiddish writing would somehow anger the Tsarist officials at the borders, tells her to tear them up, and she tears them up and throws them out the window of the train. So all of her early writing was lost. The marriage is not a happy one. Her husband is a philanderer and a drunk. He bets on horses and dogs and works irregularly. And she is in need of supporting herself and her son. So she strings beads and embroiders blouses to make ends meet. This is from the memoir by Carr. This is true. This is really what happened. She is unhappy, but she starts writing again because the husband is very rarely around, as she describes in the novel Deborah. Almost every night in bed, she firmly resolved to give up her duties of keeping house and to become a student instead. Ever since childhood, she had longed to receive an education, to cease being the nonentity of the family. She would learn things, gain understanding. She, Deborah, the girl who, as her father had once said, was to be a mere nobody when she grew up, would be a person of real consequence. She would make her own life. And at one point, she actually goes off and leaves the husband and son for about 6 months and goes back to Warsaw, where she lives a writing life. It's kind of like a do-it-yourself writing residency. And she mixes with the Yiddish literary societies there, and she writes so much, and she's very, very happy. Um, she does come back and she finds her son actually finds that she's very overprotective, and he gets worried about her because of her epileptic fits. In fact, he wants to go fight in Spain, um, fight the fascists in Spain, and he ends up not going because she, right on the eve of when he was supposed to go, she gets hospitalized. But when she returned to London, she had a lot more confidence about her writing, and she began to publish short stories in the Yiddish dailies and literary journals of Warsaw, Paris, Antwerp, London, and New York. Um, and that's when the Devil's Dance came out in 1936 in Poland, and then was translated 10 years later. Um, can we have the slide 6, The Forgotten Singer? This is the memoir that her son wrote about her. Um, and a lot of credit, I think, has to be given to her son, Maurice Carr, because he both translated her work and attempted to get it published. Um, uh, she writes about their life in London um, during the war, and it's actually a very wonderful combination of stories about life in the shtetl in Poland and then in London. And I just, just to give you a sense of how the breadth of her descriptive powers are, this is from the story called Blitz, which is in the uh, anthology called Blitz. And this is during a bombing raid in London. Their cries and the groans of the wounded are drowned out by the shouts of people standing outside their front doors who do not want to leave their ruined homes. Recklessly, they grapple with the fire, wanting to remove the debris with their bare hands, the molten lumps of earth and the bent iron beams glowing from the heat, in an attempt to drag out the people who are still alive. They only succeed in burying themselves. The lamenting around the ruins becomes increasingly bitter when people find the bodies of their own mothers and fathers, their own children and neighbors. Where is God? Asks the wife of old Abram, and she looks up at the brightly lit sky. But a bomb blast hurls her away. She lies there motionless, clutching her wig tightly in one hand. She does not ask any more questions. Such a powerful moment that she captures London during the war. Um, and there's other stories too. In fact, there's one I really want to recommend that you all read. It's called The Two Libraries, and it's a contrast between the public library and the Jewish library in London. It's a very funny story. Um, Esther Kreitman died in 1954, and much of her work was forgotten. In fact, in 1991, the British novelist and literary critic Clive Sinclair wrote in Lilith magazine, which we heard about before, that her work was mostly out of print. I feel very fortunate because I was able to discover her because I was living in London, and Virago Press, actually, which was a women's press, republished her work, it, uh, the novel Deborah. It's interesting. There's a 1938 collection of stories published in London by Faber and Faber called Jewish Short Stories. It was put together by her son, Maurice Carr, who used the pseudonym, the nom de plume, Martin Lee. And it's interesting because four of the authors were intimately related, though you wouldn't know it by their names. There was I.J. Singer, Isaac Bashevis, Esther Kreitman, and Martin Lee. So there were the four writers were in this collection. Carr says that she never sought to make capital of her belonging to the Singer family. And Bashevis admired her writing very much. He actually called her a Hasid in skirts. And he said, quote, I do not know of a single woman in Yiddish literature who wrote better than she did. Both now, Anita Norwich says, this is kind of both grudging and dismissive of women who wrote in Yiddish, or perhaps simply a sign of his ignorance of women's writing. Because you do wonder, I mean, he was a Nobel Prize winner, why he did not help her get published. But what I found was one line in his memoir, In My Father's Court, in the chapter My Sister, that gave me a little more insight that maybe it wasn't Esther Kreitman that was the model for Yentl, because Esther Kreitman didn't want to be a boy. She wanted to be a woman writer. But he wrote in this one line that our great grandmother, whose namesake my sister was, used to wear ritual fringes and visit the Bell's rabbi like a man. So maybe Yentl was actually based on their great grandmother instead of the common conception that it was based on Esther Kreitman. Um, why is this important for today? I think, as Deborah said in the last session, women's voices have been silenced, marginalized, restricted. And here is somebody who fought against all odds, her 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 parents, her own illness, her own poverty, in order to make sure that she could write and make her voice heard. Irina Klevfich, who is a author and scholar of Yiddish literature, says we have to have accurate history, and we only can have that history when our women's voices are in it. In her book called Found Treasures, which many of you may know, it's an anthology of Yiddish women writers. Women did their own publishing, and they were not viewed in the same way as the men writers. And even after the publishing, very few of them were translated into English, so there was like a double erasure. Many of the Yiddish writers that we know very well are poets, and to a certain extent, short story writers. And and obviously their work is quite amazing. We've done a lot of reading of them in Yiddish Tish, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. But actually now the Yiddish Book Center is embarking on a project to find and publish novels by women writers, which is really amazing. Um, so there's some dedicated scholars, Anita Norwich, Ellen Cassidy, Irina Klepshis, as I mentioned, who are doing the work of translating these women. Um, they have to scroll through microfilm of Yiddish newspapers to find like works that were serialized. And so, for example, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Miriam Karpelov's Diary of a Lonely Girl, or it's the subtitle or the alternative title is called The Battle Against Free Love. It's really fantastic. Um, it was written in 1916, and it's a real condemnation of men who support free love only to, make sure that they can get to bed with the woman that they're after. It's very funny, actually. So it was written in 1916, and it was published serially in a Yiddish newspaper, but it was only published and translated in English by Syracuse University Press in 2020. Um, Katya Molodovsky, who's quite well known as a poet, wrote a novel called A Jewish Refugee in New York. And again, this was discovered by scrolling through microfilm of Yiddish newspapers and seeing it translated. So it was written in 1941, and it was just published in 2019 after a translation by Anita Norwich. And what she says about doing this research, which I just love, is they were hiding in plain sight, hiding in plain sight. Can we go back to the slide of young Esther? So Anita Norwich also says there was actually a wonderful article in the New York Times where she's quoted as saying, "We're this project by the Yiddish Book Center is so important because in the next 7 years there will be more novels published by Yiddish women writers than in the last 3 decades." So we're about to read and enjoy and learn a lot more of these voices, thanks to the Yiddish Book Center. So here we have young Esther again. This is the girl whose father told her she would be a mere nobody, but she has, through her vibrant writing and her persistence, become, as she dreamed, quote, a person of real consequence. She made her own life. Thank you. And now I'd love to take any questions if I think there's time for questions.
Yeah, we
Comment.
have a good 10 minutes.
Great.
That's beautiful, Elaine. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, if people know more about the other singers, I'd love to get their impression about what I have said about them. Not to diminish their writing at all, of course.
What was the question she asked?
This is Gail. This is right here. I've only heard about this sister last year when I was reading some material. All these years, I had never really paid attention or heard that there was a sister that was a writer. So this is lovely that this is coming out, and I'm looking forward to reading the book from the 1900s. I think it would be fun to take a look at it in today's world. Thank you so much for
you're so welcome.
your presentation.
You're so welcome.
I'm sitting here in a family room. You can only see me, but I have 2 daughters with me too, and my husband, and we're all saying yes. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. You know, I think for your daughters too. I mean, she writes a lot about her childhood and her growing consciousness as a young woman, and I loved following that. I loved following her life like that. Thank you, Cindy. She's put in the chat the bibliography, which has all of the books that I mentioned, and also some of the articles that were really helpful in doing the research on this um, by Clive Sinclair and Anita Norwich in particular. Any other questions or comments or?
I was really interested in the piece where her, you know, quote unquote erratic behavior as a girl is described, and her, one of them saying maybe she's possessed by a Dybbuk,
Yeah.
and just thinking about the way in which, you know, the Dybbuk lore is very much about finding a supernatural cause for the behave um, for the non-conforming behavior of girls, and
Mm.
you see that in, you know, you see that in the Dybbuk. You see it with um, you know, the 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 Maiden of Ludmir. I don't know if people know who she was. She was a Hasidic teacher and Rebbe. People treated her as a Rebbe and followed her. And she also has this story as a child of people um, responding that she's possessed by a Dybbuk. And it's just, you know, I guess it's the way in which, like, nowadays, those things, you know, so many of what like women experience is pathologized. And in those days, instead, it was like mysticized.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jay?
Yeah, this was so wonderful. I can't wait to read her. You know, there was a period, it might have been 40 some years ago, that I picked up Isaac Bashevis singer and started reading him. And I read voraciously everything. And I felt like it was the first time I had a sense of the Jewish people in Europe rather than the Holocaust victims of Europe. It was my first inroad into that, and also that, you know, a not idealized view of Jews, but a very honest and funny, and you know, it just gave me the whole range. And so it surprises me that I didn't know about her through him more, right? Because, you know, I can't, several times I read interviews with him where he mentioned his older brother as being the real writer in the family and someone that he admired. And, you know, it was much later that I read him, and it was very different. I felt like there was a generational difference in
Hmm.
their family in terms of interiority and kind of not writing an outside story of characters, but an inside look. And so, you know, that it's very troubling that she didn't come up into my awareness when I was really listening to him and what he
Yeah.
was saying. And you know, I mean, it just really, it's it, you do tie in so well to the workshop before you, just in that how powerful the silencing has been, right? That, you know, that I'm this many years into my life, and I'm just knowing that the family was much fuller than I knew. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. You know, there's an interesting um, section in the memoir by her son, Maurice Carr, which only just came out a couple of years ago. Let me just check the date. Um, after actually after he died, his daughter, so her granddaughter Hazel, got it published in um, 2023. 2023. So it's not surprising that you haven't heard about her because, you know, all of this
Right.
writing was not accessible in English. But there's a section in this memoir where the whole family gets together at this sort of dacha in Warsaw, in or outside of Warsaw in 19 I think it's 1926, and she comes from London with her son, and so he meets the two brothers, and it's interesting how dismissive they were of her there.
mm, mm,
He was very surprised because she had always talked about her brothers like with this great admiration. And so he, as a young boy, I think he was about 12, was like so surprised that they didn't pay very much attention to her, or they
mm,
expected her to bring the tea or something like that. And so later, when she went back to Warsaw, as I mentioned earlier, on her own, she, I think they were already in New York. Definitely, Bashevis was already in New York by this time. But she found herself in a Yiddish literary world that just opened up her creativity for her, and
mm,
support. Yeah. But it is disappointing that the brothers didn't didn't talk about her too much.
mm.
Yeah. And then I was just going to go back to something that Erwin was saying about, you know, I don't, because, everybody, I mean, she's a very complex person, and she did have these illnesses. And when you hear about it from her son, as opposed to the brothers, he really felt that she was uh, way overprotective of him, and also that sometimes she used her illness to, uh, keep him close to her. Like that he didn't go to Spain, for example. And but after she went on this sort of writing residency in Warsaw, he said her fits became much less frequent. So when she had her ability to write some more, she maybe, that alleviated that. So
I think your talk, can you hear me okay?
yes.
I think your talk is very interesting and really spectacular. I don't know much about the Singer family. Be honest with you, when I would see the names of the men, I thought they were musicians. I thought they were singers. I didn't know that was a last name. Like it was always confusing to me. I wondered what they wrote, but I never investigated. So your presentation has caused me to remember a little scene I had with my mom and dad in the car. I was saying something about what I was learning in my history class at junior college. So I was about 17, and it was a women's history, U.S. history from a women's, I don't know, women's history. Anyway, I was telling him something I was learning, and my mom turned around to me in the back seat and said, "Sheridan, there is no women's history." And I never forgot that. I was like shocked. I didn't know what to say. And there's that. And if I ever tell my mom that that's what she told me, she would say she didn't remember. She would say she doesn't remember that. It was a long time ago. But I just think it's just so interesting because she was a feminist before the word even became popular, my
Wow.
mom. So it's just interesting how parents can, putting the little girl in underneath the table because they didn't want to educate her. I mean, very sad, for us. And it's very nice that in the next 7 years we're going to see more women writing in Yiddish and Yiddish stories. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, I thought so too. When I read that, I was like, oh boy, this is going to be great. You know. Yeah, I mean, it really kind of surprised me reading about her mother, because her mother was an educated woman. And she was the daughter of a very renowned rabbi who was considered a genius. There's a story about him. He was an orphan, but he was brought up. to become a scholar, and he just became quite renowned and became the rabbi of their town. And so she was never denied an education, and yet, here she was willing to go along with the fact that her daughter shouldn't be educated, and also to tear up her writing while they're on the train to Berlin is just, so painful just even to think of that scene. Yeah. Well, if there's no more questions, Erwin, I guess we can.
Yeah, we'll be Elaine, thank you so much. I also, as you know, I hadn't heard of her until 2 months ago at Yiddish Tish
Oh, yes.
when we were reading some of Bashevis Singer's memoir, and you said, well, and you started talking about Esther Kreitman, and it's like, I'm 64. I've never heard of her, and I've read Bashevis Singer for years and years, and I'm so grateful that you brought her to our attention, um, and we become part of the project of reviving her memory, and reviving her place in the canon, and yeah, to look forward to reading more of her and more of other women Yiddish novelists. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for
You're
doing.
so welcome. I was thinking about, since you know, you just casually asked me to do this, and I thought, oh, well, I don't know, can I do it with somebody else? And because I didn't know, I'm not really a scholar of hers, but I did spend so much time digging into her work, that now I'm thinking I will write something about her and the family and all this, because I mean, I did write something, but to transform it into an article for a Los Angeles Review or something like that, because, um, as I said, she is one of my favorite writers, and you could tell from the parts that I read just what a vivid writer she is. So yeah, I'm so thanks for twisting my arm.
Reba has a question.
Hi, Elaine. Good Yontif, thank you. I'm wondering, this rediscovering and republishing of people and translating them into English now, how much you see that related to this stream I'm hearing more about, called, I don't know Yiddish, but called Doikite, this idea of here-ness and really like honoring and lifting up ourselves as residents of the diaspora more, and bringing the focus of our location more to here. And if you feel like that feels related to the way that we are grounding ourselves more in diaspora, is related to this publishing and this bringing forward these voices.
Oh, that's such a great question. Actually, Erwin and I have a relationship over Doikut as well, because the book I'm working on now is based on my grandmother's diaries. And she was a member of the Bund in Chicago, and then she went back to Russia on the eve of the revolution to join her cousin, who was a member of the Bund in outside of Kiev. And so the Bund principle of Doikut is, uh, doing what you can where you are, doing the best you can for others and the world where you are. That's why they were anti-Zionist, really, because they wanted people who were, you know, in Chicago to fight for people in Chicago and not to think about going to Israel and etc. So I had asked Erwin for if he could give me a quote about Doikut. Remember this? This was about a year ago, because I start each
Did
chapter.
I?
No, you said you didn't know about it. So, so we found information about it together, um, because it's a hard word to translate, I think. Do you agree, Reba? I mean, it's more like doing what you can here and now, um, to better the world, as opposed to going somewhere else.
Most interesting definition I've heard. So yeah, that's really rich. Thank you.
Yeah. So, um, I hadn't thought about the relationship of like the Yiddish Book Center's project on women, which is mentioned in the bibliography. So you can, they have a lot of different pages in it. But I think you're absolutely right. It's like making sure that um, the cultural expression of women and the history that does exist, Sheridan, you know, is something that we can use our voices to uplift here and now. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you, Elaine.
On where we are. Thank you.
We've got 3 minutes until we can look forward to Sheridan giving us some music, a musical meditation. So I'm going to encourage folks to go reopen your breakout room icon and click on somewhere there should be a wave for you to leave the room. Oh, and if you don't, the room will be closed in 55 seconds. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Erwin.
Thank you,
Thank
Elaine.
you, Cindy.
Nice meeting you.
You know, and yes, it's magic that how did they know we were about to close?